Out of all of the 304,805 letters inside of the Sefer Torah, a handful of them are created just different. That is to say, some are miniature, some are larger, and some are just regular size. And this week, we have one of the prime examples of a smaller letter inside of the Torah. Vayikra el Moshe v'yidaber Hashem elav ma'oil moed, one of the circumstances, the novelties, the rarities that one will find inside of a Sefer Torah, where one of its letters inside of a verse is created smaller, ze'ira, or like we have find in other places, rabsi, large. There's certain halachos of how the scribe is to transcribe the Torah as the sofer, is engaging in the hilchos ksivas Sefer Torah. The Rambam codifies in his Mishnah Torah, Perek Zayin Halacha Ches of Hilchos Sefer Torah, that v'yizor ba'osios hagadolos v'osos hakatanios v'osos hanakudos v'osos hamashunos Kimosha Atiko Asoy from Ishmi Pi Ish. There's a tradition that goes back from scribe until the very first scribe, Moshe Rabbeinu, as to how the Sefer Torah must be written and to the size of each letter. And lurking mysteriously behind each one of these novelties, the small letters and the large letters, are certain hidden meanings there to be dredged, there to be drawn from the ever-deepening waters of the Torah. Some of the most famous examples will begin all the way back in Sefer Bereshis, Behi Ra'am, the famous small hay inside of the word that Hashem created. Behi Ra'am, we have that famous large yud, maybe you're aware of, from when Moshe Rabbeinu was davening after the 10 spies debacle, when he said, Hashem Yigdal, be great, trying to reference an attribute of Hashem, and the large yud is there for us to ponder. And how about, who could forget the large, the enlarged, the ginormous ayin and dalid of Shema, Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, with the enlarged ayin at the end of Shema and the large dalid at the end of Echad. Together, they actually spell and reference maybe something that we can come up with is aid, because Kriya Shema, there's a witnessing and a testimony, or maybe it's da, like knowledge, that one should know the sovereignty of the Almighty and accept it. But today's conversation is that curious, tiny, inconspicuous, and unassuming letter aleph at the end of the first word of Sefer Vayikra. Spoiler alert, that's this week's Parsha. The little aleph. Why? Why should the scribe write it this way? Because it's a halacha. But why did the Almighty organize the Torah to be written this way? Well, obviously, Torah means instruction. It's obviously instructing something, telling us a message. And we are not left groping in the dark, trying to discover the MS, because the great Rabbi Yaakov ben Usher, who you may know of as the holy Arba Turim, the author of the most important halachic book of all time. Maybe you know of Rabbi Yaakov ben Usher from his summarization of his father's psukim, the Rush, when he wrote the Kitzer Piskei HaRosh, or maybe you're familiar with his Pirush al HaTorah. Either way, what you need to know is that the Baal HaTurim, Rabbi Yaakov ben Usher, also wrote the Rimzei Baal HaTurim, the Pirush al HaTorah, that is kind of short appetizers to warm you up for his commentaries that often use gematrias, acronyms, other kind of peculiar findings inside of the Torah, sofei tevos, numerical values, that all show a deeper level of Torah. And the Baal HaTurim explains to us, right on the point, right on the dot, he raises the curtain on the literal aleph and says, what's going on here is that there is a bit of a conundrum that Moshe Rabbeinu finds himself in. Because Hashem is now calling to the prophet and about to introduce the laws of karbanos. And before one calls someone, before one educates them, they call them, they summon them. I'd like to speak with you. And as Rashi points out to us, when you call somebody with a Vayikra, that is a very significant calling. It is one of pride, one of glory and prestige. But when you call someone with a Vayikra without an aleph, it's the way that God spoke to Bilam, that kind of signifies and typifies a encountering. Not a glorious here he, but just a happenstance. Oh, just bumped into you. Good to see you, Bilam, but probably won't see you again and definitely wasn't calling you. Hence, Vayikra is the word here. Hashem is calling Moshe, and it's a very prestigious calling, but Moshe Rabbeinu, says Rashi, and as the Baal HaTurim will explain, he felt it to be awkward. He felt it to be too much prestige. To write Vayikra in a way that everyone who learns the Torah hereafter will know that God called me, God called Moshe in this honorable way. Moshe Rabbeinu did not want to write the aleph. He wanted to ditch the aleph and just write Vayikra, because the prophet of Israel was so humble that he would rather be it without the aleph and be called the same way that the wretched Bilam was called. In order to find peace, to make shalom, Moshe Rabbeinu made a pshara. He settled. And he decided he would write the aleph, but he would write it small. Zok the Baal HaTurim. Aleph de Vayikra Ze'ira, she Moshe haya gadol v'anav. Moshe was great and he was humble. Lo ratza lichtov ela Vayikra. He wanted to just write Vayikra, not Vayikra. Kederach shenemar bebilam. Ki'ilu lo nira lo Hashem ela b'mikra. It was just a chance. V'omar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu lichtov gam ha'aleph. Put the aleph in the Torah. Make it known that it's a Vayikra el Moshe. What did Moshe do? The Kasva Katana. He wrote it miniature. He wrote it small. In an act of anti-pride seeking. An act of anava, humility. It's already remarkable to see Moshe Rabbeinu's humility and how he cares very little about how he's addressed. I know that sometimes I get a little bit of a pit in my stomach if somebody will address their wedding invitation to my house and sometimes just write Mike Brook, sometimes write Rabbi, the great Rabbi Michal Brook. I like it when they write that. And sometimes they just write Mr. Brook. But it's interesting that we care how we're called. And Moshe Rabbeinu, he would like to be called the same way that Bilam was referred to and summoned. Speaks to Moshe's unbelievable unassumingness and humility. We also see another takeaway from the Baal HaTurim, that Moshe Rabbeinu, in an effort to stay humble, he didn't just internalize a mindset, but he actually did an action, a writing of a small letter. It's kind of funny how that makes someone humble, but we see that actions, this was definitely a tachbula, something that he did to remain humble, and we see that acting humble does seemingly bring to continued humility. But that's not today's topic. Today's topic is one of the most incredible talks, nekudos, points ever delivered. And it came from the mouth of the great Rebbe Elazar Menachem man Shach, the great Haredi Rav, the Gadol Hadar, the leader of the Jewish people and the leader of the free world from the early 1970s until his death. He was chairman of all of the Council of the Sages and one of the three co-Rosh Yeshivas of the Ponevezher Yeshiva in Bnei Brak. Reb Shach with literally hundreds of thousands of hours of amelus b'Torah under his belt, connected to God in a way that few have. And in his Sefer Machshavas Musar, which is the Musar discourses on the Parsha that he gave in yeshiva that his Talmidim transcribed, he asked the following question. He begins by saying, why is it that Moshe chose to write the small aleph here? The aleph ze'ira in the word Vayikra in order to remain humble, says Reb Shach. Fantastic, but this isn't the only time that Vayikra is stated in regards to being called to Moshe from the Almighty. Why punkt here in this situation? Does Moshe say small aleph? What about the later instances or the earlier instances of a small aleph? V'oymar lochem davar she'ulai eineni yochol, says Rav Shach, and I'll tell you something that perhaps I am unable to, v'eineni rashai, and I am not fitting to, l'dover l'hovenkach, and I maybe shouldn't even be thinking this. But Baruch Hashem, Rav Shach tells us. Continues Rav Shach to say that we think that when the Torah says that Moshe Rabbeinu was an Ish anav mikol adam, he is the most humble of all men on the earth, that he was born that way, that he never had a struggle in his life, that he was the perfect person from the womb, and that his humility was, well, kind of natural, and kind of grew based on his incredible netios, his DNA. It was wired for such a thing. But Rav Shach warns us. He tells us that's not how we believe. We believe that man was given a life, a soul, a body. And as Cholos HaLevavos says, if you're living, the Yetzer Hara never leaves a person even for a moment. He's constantly awake and watching you sleep, constantly throwing prideful remarks at you, and constantly putting stumbling blocks in front of your growth, constantly putting blockades to inhibit your progress of getting closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his Torah. But when the Torah says that Moshe Rabbeinu was the Ish Anav Mikol Adam, that is to say that he was one of the most hard-working and smart individuals that would constantly come up with new techniques in order to drive home his anava, in order to take him to the next step. Every day was a new challenge. We're told by Shlomo HaMelech that the Yetzer Leiv Ha'adam Ra Min Urav, the Yetzer of a person, it is evil from his youth. And every single day, it's miskaber alav b'chol yoim v'yoim. Every day, new tricks he has. Every day, new ways to make you stumble. And if you are to ever emerge victorious, then it's constant game planning, strategizing, and scheming to counter his attacks. Zok Reb Shach. That when Moshe Rabbeinu got to Parshas Vayikra, it was a new day in his life, and it was a new trick of the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara put into Moshe's head, Vayikra. That's fancy. Wow, you really are something special. Prideful remarks from the Yetzer Hara were being shot like bow and arrows into Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu, with his Mochemes HaYetzer, with his stratagems and game planning, today, Parshas Vayikra, right when he's putting pen to paper with his godly infused pen, does he come up with a new strategy? He has an idea, a new tachbula. I know what I'm going to do to stay humble, and he's machadish today. He comes up with this new approach of small aleph. Take that, Yetzer Hara. It's a fight back. Because Moshe was human, but Moshe succeeded because of constant shikol adas, v'chishav ha'ma'asim, v'tachbulos noiroos keneged ha'yetzer. He knew how to counterattack the Yetzer Hara. And so Rav Shach answers, why is it only Vayikra that we find that Moshe came up with this small aleph and not the other Vayikras? Because that was his newfound counterattack on that day against the Yetzer Hara. And he maybe came up with different approaches on other days. What a chiddush from Reb Shach. And when I first saw it, it knocked my socks off and my sandals off, or my Echo shoes off, quite literally. But then I thought, wait a second. I've heard this somewhere. I heard this from Abaye. Abaye, who is wont to say, accustomed to say, in the habit of saying, Margela bipume de Abaye, la'olam ye adam arum bihira. Abaye was wont to say that a person should always be arum bihira. What does that mean? Arum is the same word that the Torah introduces us to the snake in Parshas Bereshis. The Nachash was haya arum mikol hachayos, or mikol habehemos ha'adama. I'm definitely quoting that pasuk wrong, but it definitely says the word arum there. Conniving. It means shrewd. Shrewd in your fear of heaven. Rashi says, arum bayira laha'arim b'chol mine arma. Liyiras bayro. Laha'arim b'chol mine arma. To be shrewd in all manners of shrewdness. To be game planning in all matters of strategic game planning. Liras boro, to fear Hashem. You hear this? Shrewdness. Game planning. Maybe even a bit of, not God forbid, cheating, but wiliness, guilefulness, craftiness, maybe a bit of even cunningness should be used to fear Hashem. It actually makes a lot of sense because we know that the Yetzer Hara doesn't play fair. I don't know if this to be true, but there are times that when every once in a while, every couple months, I'll actually be in the mood to sit down and want to learn, then maybe I'll find myself with a stomach ache. And I'll often ask myself, that's not fair. How can the Yetzer Hara give me a stomach ache on the one day that I now want to learn and now I can't learn? So I don't know if this is correct, but it definitely seems like the Yetzer Hara has his fair or unfair cheap shots. So can't we also conclude that if we aren't a step ahead of the game, if we are not at least counter-attacking him, then we have no shot? If he's staring at us while we're asleep and organizing his attacks to go from the south side where we're still weak and our armor is leaving us exposed, don't we have to be arum beyira and be great in our scheming to be able to beat him and truly fear Hashem? I thought further, of course I know that this concept is somewhere deep in my brain. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he told his disciples on his deathbed that, my dearest disciples, I give you a blessing on my final day that your fear of heaven should be like your fear of people. To which the bewildered disciples retorted and said, Rebbe, how could that be? Thus far and no more? That's all you're going to give us a blessing of, that we should fear God like we fear people? But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai responded with a rebuttal to their retort by saying, Alavai, if only you should fear heaven like you feared people, like you fear people. I think that's a perfect example of being arum beyira. You display and understand different mindsets in order to catapult your fear. You are cunning and you realize that I would never get caught red-handed stealing or speaking ill about somebody in front of them, steal from the store in front of the shopkeeper. But maybe I would do it behind his back or speak ill gossip if they weren't paying attention or if it was only through text. But arum Vayikra means you understand and you use your incredible koyach of imagery and imagination to reframe your relationship with Hashem in a way that becomes very real, very tangible. What a brilliant scheme. What a brilliant way to live life. Speaking from the heart, I'll tell you that when I started the Motivation congregation, it came up, it really came to be because of a scheme. The scheme was that I wasn't so excited about sitting down to learn. Learning was hard. At times the Gemara seemed incomprehensible, like it just wasn't made for me. But I did have some clarity that what I like in this world is prestige, or being told that I know how to learn, or maybe even making some crisp blue Benjamins. So I put Torah on the path or in the way as the rainbow to get to the pot of gold on the other side of prestige and money. I said, if I make an obligation for myself that I have to teach, and people will then listen to what I'm saying, because you can only teach if somebody listens. So then I would force myself daily to have to say something that made sense, because I am putting my pride on the line and sending this Torah video out. So now it has to be good. Otherwise, someone will say that I am illiterate and dumb. So let's try to work hard and get better and better at it. And I thought, well, maybe if I even do it long enough and I become strong enough in my learning, maybe even someone will want to financially commit to want to learn with me, maybe even try to book a speaking engagement. But all of it, it was done in a little bit of a shrewd way. And I hope it was approved by God, but it helped me to open the books more times than not. A tachbula. This Gemara makes me feel better about myself, and this Rashi that you should use, Zokt Rashi, Laharim b'chomine arma, to use all types of shrewd calculations. Some wily procedures. The Yiras Boro, to come to fear of heaven. People use meditation. People use intense graphs and charts and reward themselves with different things to push their fear of heaven. They tell themselves 5 more minutes and I won't go there. They'll know that if I do this, then that will lead towards this happening. So they 3 steps before they get near anything, they come up with different schemes as to how they're going to refrain from it and never get close to it. But today's conclusion is that if Moshe Rabbeinu needed scheming, and as Rav Shach puts it, came up with a new scheme, a new play, a play-action pass when the defense was blitzing, when the Yetzer Hara wanted Moshe to feel prideful about his connection to Hashem and his position of power. And Moshe came back with a small aleph as the flea flicker, as the defense fell right into the trap. And now we get a lesson in humility. And Moshe Rabbeinu came up with it on that day to counterattack the Yetzer Hara's quick and cheap move. How much more so should we be on the lookout that every day, b'chol yom, that the Yetzer Hara is miskaber against us, that we game plan, that we understand that with tremendous foresight and hashkafa rabbah and tremendous planning, we too can prove triumphant against our formidable foe. Write our own small alephs, if you will. I want to just conclude with a couple examples of what you could even think of doing. If you struggle to wake up in the morning, why don't you book yourself a chavrusa before shachar? That's arum Vayikra. Book it with a rabbi, the rabbi of the shul, and ask him if you'll learn with him for 15 minutes, or he'll learn with you for 15 minutes before Shachris, and that might trick yourself into having to wake up. If you want to have more kavanah during Shmona Esrei, don't just tell yourself, concentrate, think, but tell yourself that I'm going to pray with my finger on the place, or say every word out loud. If you want to stay till the end of davening, then think, I'm just going to have concentration in one tefillah or one paragraph for the whole davening, and that's going to be Aleinu. And Aleinu becomes your new favorite part of davening, and just by coincidence, you happen to be staying for the entire davening. That's how you write your own aleph. And that's what Rav Shach told us, is how Moshe Rabbeinu continued to reach the top. But he kept coming up with new strategies, and he was totally arum Vayikra. So, the challenge awaits. Because if Moshe Rabbeinu, he needed certain approaches to beat the Yetzer Hara, and he did, how much more so that in 2025, we also should be on the lookout with Hashkafa Rabel and Shikol Hadas to also write our own small alephs to prove triumphant against our formidable foe.
Kilam kedoshim